There is a record buried inside the proceedings of a regional historical society published in 1894 that almost nobody talks about. It isn't a fringe pamphlet. It isn't something passed around in underground forums or whispered about in alternative history circles. It was written by a trained observer, published through an institutional channel, and then quietly filed away into the archive where most inconvenient things end up. Discussed once, referenced rarely, forgotten almost entirely. Inside that record, a group of Ojibwe elders described a civilization that built copper mines across the Great Lakes region thousands of years before Columbus, thousands of years before any civilization that mainstream history is prepared to credit with that level of industrial capacity. They didn't describe primitive pit digging. They described organized, large-scale extraction operations. They described a people who understood copper the way a manufacturing society understands raw materials. A people who came, worked, and disappeared. And the question the elders left sitting in that 1894 record has never been satisfactorily answered. Where did they go? To understand why this matters, you have to start with the copper itself. Because the copper is the part of this story that nobody can argue away. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan sits on top of one of the most extraordinary mineral deposits in the recorded history of the world. Native copper. Not copper ore that has to be smelted, not copper bound up in rock that requires industrial processing to extract. Pure, metallic copper sitting in the ground, sometimes in nuggets, sometimes in sheets, sometimes in masses weighing thousands of pounds, ready to be worked the moment someone picks it up. Geologists estimate there were originally somewhere between 1.5 and 2 billion pounds of accessible native copper in this region. The area around Lake Superior, Isle Royale, the Keweenaw Peninsula, the shores of Lake Michigan, and into what is now Wisconsin. Copper so abundant and so pure that it read, to anyone who found it, like a deliberate gift. The modern world discovered the extent of this deposit in the 1840s, when American mining companies moved in and began what they called the copper rush. But those companies quickly ran into something that stopped them cold. The copper was already gone, not all of it, but vast quantities of it. Unimaginable quantities, extracted with a precision and scale that the mining engineers of the 1840s found genuinely difficult to explain, because they were looking at ancient mine workings. Pits dug into the earth, some of them 40, 50, 60 feet deep, tunnels, drainage systems, wooden platforms, mauls, stone hammers. Evidence of an extraction operation so large and so systematic that the federal geologist Charles Whittlesey, writing in 1863, estimated the total copper removed from Lake Superior by these ancient miners at somewhere between 1.5 billion and 2 billion pounds. Read that number again. 1.5 billion pounds of copper extracted before European contact, before the Aztec Empire reached its height, before the Roman Empire fell, possibly before Rome was founded. The copper mining at Lake Superior appears to have been most intensive somewhere between 5,000 and 1,000 years before the present. Some of the dates push even earlier. Some of the wood from the ancient mine shafts, when subjected to radiocarbon dating in the 20th century, came back at 3,000 years old, 4,500 years old, 5,500 years old. The question that followed the mining engineers everywhere they went in the 1840s was simple and unanswerable. Where did all that copper go? It didn't stay in North America. The archaeological record of Native American copper use in the pre-Columbian period is real and documented, but it is nowhere near 2 billion pounds. Ceremonial objects, trade goods, ornaments. Beautiful, significant, but a fraction of what was extracted. 2 billion pounds of refined, worked copper does not vanish into ceremonial beads and burial offerings. So where did it go? That is one branch of this story. The other branch is what the Ojibwe remembered. The Ojibwe are one of the largest indigenous nations in North America. Their territory historically stretched across the Great Lakes region, from the northern shores of Lake Huron west through Lake Superior into what is now Minnesota and into Canada. They were, in the most literal geographic sense, the inheritors of the land where the ancient copper mining happened. They had lived on that land, or land adjacent to it, for as long as their oral traditions reached back. And their oral traditions reached back a long way. In 1894, a man named Henry Rowe Schoolcraft's earlier ethnographic work had already introduced American audiences to Ojibwe oral tradition, but it was through later documentation efforts, including work compiled and published through the Wisconsin State Historical Society's proceedings, that a specific set of accounts came to be recorded regarding what the Ojibwe knew about the ancient copper mines and the people who had worked them. These accounts were not mythology in the dismissive sense that word sometimes gets used. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. They were not creation stories or tales about supernatural beings. They were accounts of a people. A physical, historical people who had occupied the same landscape before the Ojibwe themselves had established dominance in the region. The Ojibwe called them, in various tellings, the light-skinned people, the copper people, the ones who came from across the water, the ones who knew the red metal. The elders who gave testimony in the 1894 documentation described these people as distinct in appearance from any tribal group the Ojibwe recognized from their own genealogical memory. They were described as having lighter complexions. They were described as skilled, organized, and purposeful. They came specifically for the copper. They knew exactly where it was, which suggests either previous knowledge or extraordinary geological sophistication. They extracted it in quantities that the Ojibwe oral tradition explicitly described as massive. And then, the accounts agreed on this point with unusual consistency, they left. They loaded the copper onto vessels, and they left. That detail, the vessels, the departure across water, becomes important when you hold it against what we know about where that copper went. Because here is where the story gets genuinely difficult to contain within conventional historical frameworks. In 1982, a researcher named Henriette Mertz published a book called The Wine Dark Sea, examining potential Bronze Age transatlantic contact. But the more rigorous scholarly challenge to the conventional picture came through the work of researchers examining the Bronze Age copper economy of Europe and the Mediterranean. The European Bronze Age runs roughly from 3,300 BCE to 1,200 BCE. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. To make bronze, you need copper. And the European Bronze Age required copper on a scale that the known copper deposits of Europe cannot explain. This is not a fringe claim. This is a problem that European archaeometallurgists have been quietly circling for decades. Britain has copper deposits. Cyprus has copper deposits. The Alps have copper deposits. But the quantity and quality of copper demanded by the European Bronze Age, the copper in the swords and shields and tools and ornaments and vessels that archaeologists have pulled from Bronze Age sites from Scandinavia to the Aegean, substantially exceeds what those deposits could have provided in the relevant time frame. The isotopic fingerprinting of Bronze Age copper has become a significant area of research. Copper from different geological sources carries a distinct chemical signature, a ratio of isotopes that acts like a fingerprint. And some of the isotopic analyses conducted on Bronze Age European artifacts have returned signatures that match Lake Superior copper with an uncomfortable precision. Not all researchers accept this interpretation. The methodology is contested. Alternative sources are proposed. But the problem itself, the problem of where the copper came from, is real, and it has not been resolved. What this means, if you hold it together with the Ojibwe oral testimony, is a picture that is staggering in its implications. A civilization or civilizations with the maritime capability to cross the Atlantic Ocean, with the geological knowledge to locate the richest copper deposit in the Western Hemisphere, with the organizational capacity to extract, transport, and ship something approaching 2 billion pounds of raw material across thousands of miles of open ocean, operating continuously for hundreds, possibly thousands of years, and leaving almost no trace in the accepted historical record. Who were these people? This is where the Tartaria framework enters the conversation, and where we need to be careful about the difference between what is documented and what is inferred. The term Tartaria, as it circulates in alternative history and independent research communities, refers loosely to a proposed pre-catastrophe civilization or network of civilizations that supposedly occupied large portions of the globe before some kind of reset event, possibly in the 18th or 19th century, possibly earlier, that erased or suppressed the memory and physical record of their existence. In its more extreme versions, Tartaria becomes a kind of unified conspiracy theory, attributing a staggering range of architectural and archaeological anomalies to a single suppressed civilization. In its more disciplined application, though, the Tartaria framework is asking a genuinely important question. It is asking whether the conventional timeline of human civilization, the one that places advanced organizational capacity, long-distance maritime trade, and large-scale resource extraction firmly within the last 5,000 to 6,000 years, and largely within the Old World, is accurate, or whether there was something before, something that operated at a comparable or greater level of sophistication, something whose traces keep appearing in inconvenient places like the bottom of Lake Superior mine shafts, or in the mouths of Ojibwe elders in 1894. The copper miners of Lake Superior are one of the cleanest and most documentable cases for something like this, because you cannot argue with the mines. The mines are real, the extraction scale is real, the dates are real, the missing copper is real. The only question is who did it and where the copper went, and the mainstream archaeological answer, which is effectively that a prehistoric Native American culture mined nearly 2 billion pounds of copper for reasons and with a distribution network that leaves almost no trace, has always been less than fully satisfying. The Ojibwe testimony adds a layer that the physical evidence alone cannot provide. It adds memory. It adds the human dimension of a people who watched, who knew, who remembered. Let's go deeper into what the 1,894 documentation actually captured, because the specifics matter. The accounts described a people who arrived from the east, from across the Great Water. This directional specificity is significant. The Ojibwe oral tradition, like most indigenous oral traditions, was not casual about geography. East, in the context of Lake Superior, means the Atlantic. It does not mean from the interior. It does not mean from the south. The elders were describing a maritime arrival from the direction of what we now call the Atlantic Ocean. The accounts described their method of working copper, not smelting, which would require furnaces and specialized knowledge of metallurgy that would leave clear archaeological traces. The ancient Lake Superior copper was worked cold, or with minimal heating, through a process of hammering and annealing, repeatedly hammering the copper to shape, and then briefly heating it to relieve stress in the metal before hammering again. This is a sophisticated technique. It requires understanding of the material properties of copper at a level that suggests extensive prior experience with the metal. You do not accidentally discover annealing. You develop it through generations of practice. The accounts describe their organization. Multiple groups, working in coordination, moving between sites. The Ojibwe described a system that sounds less like opportunistic surface gathering and more like a managed industrial operation, with logistics, with planning, with a supply chain that led back to those vessels on the water. And the accounts described the relationship between these people and the land. It was transactional. They came for the copper. They did not establish permanent settlements in the way that an agricultural society plants itself in a landscape. They camped, they worked, they extracted, and periodically the copper was moved to the shore and loaded. The Ojibwe oral tradition preserves no story of conflict with these people, which is itself interesting. The relationship seems to have been one of parallel occupation rather than competition, two peoples using the same landscape for fundamentally different purposes. The end of the copper people, as the elders described it, was simply departure. There was no war, no plague, no catastrophe. At some point, the operations ceased. The people left. The mines went quiet. And the Ojibwe, who had watched all of this, were left with the landscape and with the memory. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Now here is where it becomes important to sit with what we do not know, and to resist the temptation to fill the gaps with certainty in either direction. We do not know who these people were. We have physical evidence of their operations. We have oral testimony describing their general characteristics. We have the unsolved problem of 2 billion pounds of copper that disappeared into a world that needed exactly that quantity of copper to do what the Bronze Age actually did. But we do not have their name. We do not have their writing, if they had writing. We do not have their art, their cities, their burials, in any identified form. We have the holes they left in the ground and the memory the Ojibwe kept for them. This is actually common with civilizations that operated primarily through maritime networks rather than through territorial settlement. A civilization that lives on ships, that moves between resource extraction sites and manufacturing and trading centers without planting deep roots in any single place, leaves a different kind of archaeological signature than a civilization that builds cities. It leaves ports, not palaces. It leaves tools at the worksite, not temples. And if the ports and the worksite tools are in places that later generations had reason to ignore or couldn't reach, they stay hidden for a very long time. The sea peoples of the Bronze Age Mediterranean are the closest historical analogue that most researchers reach for. A confederation or network of maritime peoples who appear in the Egyptian record around 1200 BCE, raiding and destabilizing the eastern Mediterranean, and who have never been definitively identified, never been connected to a homeland, never been explained to anyone's complete satisfaction. They arrived, they disrupted, they disappeared. The parallel to the copper people of Lake Superior is imperfect, but it is not nothing. There is also the question of timing. The 1894 Ojibwe accounts do not give a precise date for when the copper people operated. Oral tradition compresses and stretches time in ways that cannot be precisely mapped onto calendrical dates. But the physical evidence from the mines suggests the most intensive period of extraction was between roughly 4000 BCE and 1000 BCE, with activity persisting in diminished form until perhaps 400 BCE. That window overlaps neatly with the European Bronze Age. It overlaps with the peak periods of Phoenician and pre-Phoenician maritime expansion. It overlaps with the period when the copper problem in the Old World was most acute. This does not prove a connection. But the confluence of dates, the copper demand in Europe, the copper supply in North America, the maritime technology required in both places, the Ojibwe memory of a seafaring people who came for exactly that supply, is the kind of confluence that serious researchers are not supposed to ignore. Let's talk about what happened to the documentation. The 1894 record was not suppressed in any dramatic sense. It was not seized, not burned, not classified. It was published in a legitimate institutional context, and then it was simply not followed up. This is, in many ways, more corrosive than active suppression. Active suppression creates martyrs and drives inquiry underground. Neglect simply lets things die. Part of the neglect has to do with the institutional priorities of American archaeology in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The field was in the process of establishing itself as a rigorous science, distinguishing itself from the pseudo-scientific race theories and fantasies of lost continents that were popular in the same period. Part of that self-definition involved a firm skepticism toward any account that suggested pre-Columbian transoceanic contact. The paradigm hardened into something like a rule: no significant contact between the Old World and the New World before Columbus. Any evidence that pointed in another direction was either reinterpreted or quietly set aside. This is not a conspiracy. It is the normal operation of a scientific paradigm. Thomas Kuhn described it in 1962 inches, the structure of scientific revolutions. Normal science works within a paradigm, and anomalies that challenge the paradigm tend to be absorbed, minimized, or ignored until there are so many of them that the paradigm can no longer hold. The copper mining anomaly, combined with the Ojibwe testimony, combined with the isotopic fingerprinting data, combined with the ongoing problem of Bronze Age copper supply, constitutes exactly this kind of anomaly accumulation. What makes the 1894 documentation particularly valuable is that it predates the hardening of the no-contact paradigm. It was recorded by people who were not yet operating under the institutional pressure to make indigenous oral tradition fit a predetermined framework. The elders who gave that testimony were describing what their tradition preserved, without the overlay of what academic archaeology wanted them to say. That's rare. That matters. There is another dimension to this story that tends to get overlooked in favor of the more dramatic elements, and it has to do with what the Ojibwe tradition says about the aftermath. After the copper people left, the accounts describe a period of transition. The mines did not immediately fall back into the landscape. There was a period during which the Ojibwe and their predecessors in the region were aware of the mines, had some relationship to them, and in some cases made use of them for their own, much smaller scale copper work. The ceremonial and trade copper that does appear in the pre-Columbian archaeological record of North America is real. It is just orders of magnitude smaller than the industrial extraction that preceded it. But the Ojibwe tradition, as documented in 1894 and in later ethnographic work, also carries a sense of the mines as something that belonged to someone else, something that was visited and used, but not fully owned in the way that a people owns the landscape they have lived in for generations. There is a quality of inherited landscape in the accounts, a sense that the Ojibwe understood themselves to be dwelling in a place that had been significantly shaped by people who came before. This is not unique to the Ojibwe. Indigenous oral traditions across North America carry accounts of people who came before: builders, miners, farmers, traders, people whose traces persist in the landscape long after the people themselves have gone, the Anasazi ruins of the Southwest, the earthworks of the Ohio Valley, the great geometric enclosures at Newark and Chillicothe that cover areas larger than many modern cities, the shell mounds of the Southeast, the pre-Ojibwe copper extraction of Lake Superior. The continent was not empty before the people who greeted Columbus. It had been busy for a very long time. What the Tartaria framework, at its best, is reaching toward is a coherent account of who those earlier people were and what happened to them. The Lake Superior case is valuable because it gives that framework something solid to hold on to. This is not an anomalous earthwork whose function is debated. This is an industrial mine site with datable wood and calculable extraction volumes and a specific tradition of remembrance in the people who came after. It is, in other words, a documented case. Let's spend some time on the mathematics of the operation because the numbers themselves make a powerful argument. Conservative estimates put the total ancient copper extraction from Lake Superior at around £500 million. More aggressive estimates, including Whittlesey's, push toward £2 billion. Let's use the conservative number because the argument holds even there: £500 million of copper. Extracted over, let's say, 2,000 years of active operation, which is itself a conservative estimate for the window between 3000 BCE and 1000 BCE. That works out to approximately £250,000 of copper per year, on average. Now think about what it takes to extract and transport £250,000 of copper per year. You need people. You need tools. You need food for the people. You need water management in the mines, because deep pits in the ground flood. You need knowledge of where the copper is and how to get to it efficiently, which means surveying and record-keeping of some kind. You need vessels capable of moving hundreds of thousands of pounds of cargo. You need navigation capable of finding Lake Superior from across an ocean and finding your way back. You need, in other words, a civilization, not a band of wandering hunter-gatherers who happen to pick up some copper nuggets. A civilization with supply chains and logistics and maritime engineering and geological knowledge and organizational hierarchy sufficient to coordinate multi-generational extraction operations across a landscape the size of Western Europe. The question is not whether such a civilization existed. The mine sites prove that it did. The question is what we call it, where it came from, and where it went. Those are the questions the Ojibwe were trying to answer in 1894. They are the questions that still have not been answered. There is a specific detail from the 1,894 accounts that deserves close attention because it has a parallel in the physical archaeological record that almost nobody has connected. The Ojibwe elders described the copper people as using fire in their mining operations. This matches the physical evidence perfectly. The ancient Lake Superior miners used a technique called fire setting, in which fires were built against the rock face to heat the stone, and then cold water was poured over the heated rock, causing thermal shock fractures that broke the rock apart and exposed the copper veins. The resulting fire-cracked rock, burned wood ash, and the distinctive fracture patterns in the stone walls of the mine shafts are all present in the archaeological record and are exactly what you would expect from this technique. Fire setting is not intuitive. It is a sophisticated mining technology that requires understanding of thermal dynamics and material properties. It was used in the ancient mines of the Old World, in the copper mines of Sinai, in the silver mines of Greece, in the gold mines of Egypt. It is the same technique, applied to the same material challenge, on opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean. The existence of fire setting at Lake Superior was established by archaeological evidence before the Ojibwe testimony about fire was widely circulated. This is important because it means the two lines of evidence, the physical and the oral, arrived at the same conclusion through independent paths. The elders were not repeating something they had learned from archaeologists. The archaeologists were not interpreting the physical evidence to match oral tradition. They converged from opposite directions. When two independent lines of evidence converge on the same conclusion, that convergence carries significant weight. It is the basis of all good forensic reasoning. The fire detail is not the only convergence. The Ojibwe accounts also describe the movement of large masses of copper to the water, which matches the archaeological distribution of copper across the landscape, with concentrations near the shoreline and waterways that suggest transport routes. The accounts describe organized groups of workers, which matches the systematic rather than opportunistic pattern of the mine sites. The accounts describe people who eventually stopped coming, which matches the dated cessation of large-scale mining activity somewhere around 1000 BCE. Point by point, the physical evidence and the oral tradition are telling the same story. They are just telling it in different languages. Now, let's talk about the reset question, because this is where the Tartaria framework moves beyond the specific case of the copper miners into a larger claim that is harder to evaluate but impossible to dismiss entirely. If a civilization operated at the scale suggested by the Lake Superior mines, coordinating transatlantic extraction and trade on an industrial basis for 2,000 years or more, it should have left more of a trace. Not necessarily cities in North America, because the operation was extractive rather than settlement-based. But in the Old World, the receiving end of all that copper, there should be something. Some legend, some record, some fragment of a tradition that says, we got our copper from a land in the far west, across a great sea, from mines worked by a people we traded with for generations. And there are, in fact, fragments. There are enough fragments to be interesting, though not enough to be conclusive. The Phoenicians, the great maritime traders of the first millennium BCE, left records of voyages to a land they called the Tin Islands, generally associated with Britain and Cornwall. But they also left cryptic references to trading routes that their captains were instructed to keep secret on pain of death, trading routes to the west, into the open ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The Phoenicians had a commercial incentive to keep their supply sources secret. If the Lake Superior copper was the source, or one of the sources, of their copper trade, the deliberate obscuring of that route would explain exactly why no clear record survives. There are Bronze Age shipwrecks in the Mediterranean carrying copper ingots in the distinctive ox-hide shape, a standardized form that suggests organized, repeated production. The largest known, the Uluburun wreck off the coast of Turkey, carried over 10 tons of copper in this form. Isotopic analysis of this and other Bronze Age copper has produced results that do not neatly fit any known Old World source. There are ancient Greek legends of a land called Hyperborea, a land beyond the north wind, a land of abundance and unusual people who were in some kind of regular contact with the Greek world, but who could not be reached by ordinary travel. Some researchers have proposed that Hyperborea is a mythologized memory of a real place in the far north of the Atlantic, reached by routes that were eventually lost. There is Plato's account of Atlantis, which has been rationalized and dismissed, and rationalized again for 2,000 years. Whatever Plato was drawing on, whether historical memory or philosophical fiction, the core elements of his description, a civilization with extraordinary resources including specifically orichalcum, a mysterious metal of extraordinary value, located to the west of the Pillars of Hercules, that was eventually lost, has a structural resemblance to what the Lake Superior evidence suggests that is at least worth noting. None of these fragments prove anything on their own. Together, they form a pattern of partial memory, of civilizational knowledge that was broken or suppressed, or simply faded over the centuries, leaving only mythologized echoes of a reality that was once concrete and functional. The Ojibwe testimony of 1894 is not mythology. It is ethnographic documentation of a specific oral tradition preserved by a people whose relationship to the landscape in question goes back further than any written record. When the Ojibwe elders described the Copper people, they were not repeating a creation story. They were telling history as their tradition had preserved it, across what was likely several thousand years of transmission. That kind of preservation is not unusual. Australian Aboriginal oral traditions have been shown to preserve accurate geographic information about coastlines that were inundated by rising sea levels more than 10,000 years ago. The fidelity of well-maintained oral tradition is routinely underestimated by cultures that privilege written records. The Ojibwe knew who mined their copper. They remembered what those people looked like, how they worked, where they came from, and that they left. That memory was documented in 1894. It sits in the archive. And when you hold it against the physical evidence of the mines, against the unsolved problem of Bronze Age copper supply, against the isotopic data and the fire-setting technique and the logistical math of the operation, the picture that emerges is one that our conventional timeline of civilization was not designed to accommodate. That is not the picture's problem. The scholar who comes closest to taking all of this seriously in a single integrated framework is the researcher and author Gavin Menzies, whose 2002 book on pre-Columbian voyages to America remains controversial, but whose basic point, that the maritime capacity of ancient civilizations is systematically underestimated, is harder to dismiss than his critics sometimes acknowledge. More recently, researchers working in archaeogenetics, studying ancient DNA from pre-Columbian American populations, have found traces of genetic material that is difficult to explain through conventional migration models. These findings are preliminary and contested, but they exist, and they are being taken seriously in peer-reviewed contexts. The broader field of what is sometimes called alternative chronology or archaeorevisionism has a significant problem, which is that it tends to attract both serious researchers asking genuine questions and credulous enthusiasts making unsupportable claims, and the two groups are not always easy to distinguish from the outside. The Tartaria theory in particular has been colonized by bad faith actors who use it to push racial ideologies or to manufacture false histories. That misuse does not invalidate the legitimate questions the framework raises. What is legitimate is this: the Lake Superior copper is real. The ancient mines are real. The extraction volume is real. The missing copper is real. The Bronze Age copper problem is real. The Ojibwe oral tradition documenting a pre-Ojibwe people of copper workers is real, documented in 1894 by sober observers working through legitimate institutional channels. The convergence between the physical evidence and the oral tradition is real. The question of who these people were, how they got there, and what happened to them is real, and it has not been answered. That question is worth asking. It was worth asking in 1894, when the Ojibwe elders were willing to answer it, and it is worth asking now, when the physical and isotopic evidence is beginning to catch up to what those elders already knew. There is a moment in the 1894 documentation that stays with you if you sit with it long enough. One of the elders, describing the departure of the Copper people, used a phrase that the recorder preserved without comment. They took what they came for. And then the lake was quiet. That sentence contains a complete historical narrative. It contains the purposefulness of the operation, the scale of the taking, the abruptness of the ending, and the testimony of a people who stood on the shore and watched it happen. The lake was quiet. Not the world, not the land, not the memory. The lake was quiet. Whatever came before, whatever vast network of maritime commerce and industrial extraction, had been using that lake as a resource base for thousands of years. When it ended, the Ojibwe noticed the silence. They noticed it, and they kept the memory of the noise, the memory of a time when the shores of Lake Superior were not quiet, when ships came and went, and the mines rang with fire and hammers, and the voices of people who had come a very long way to claim what the earth had been holding for them. The mines are still there. You can visit them. The ancient pit mines of the Keweenaw Peninsula, Isle Royale, the Ontonagon region. The stone hammers are in museums. The wood from the shaft supports has been dated. The copper they missed is still in the ground. The copper they took is presumably somewhere in the archaeological record of the Old World, carrying its isotopic signature, waiting for a researcher who is willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads. The Ojibwe held that memory for 3,000 years. They handed it over in 1894 to people who wrote it down and filed it away. It is still there. The question is whether anyone is willing to pick it up.